friends. Welcome to Sky House Herbs podcast. I'm Ashley Elenbaas, a clinical herbalist, and in this space, I share my knowledge and experience with plant medicine to help you on your own journey of healing and transformation. Join me in exploring the ancient wisdom of plant spirit medicine and how it can be used to heal the body, mind, and spirit. We'll talk to experts in the field and share stories from people who've been transformed by powerful plant allies. New episodes are released each Monday, so please subscribe. And now, let's explore this mystical world of plant medicine together. Hey everyone, welcome in. I am so glad that you're here with me today. I am so happy to be here. And in today's episode, we are going to dive into the goddess Death. We're going to look at the herb lemon balm and honey, and we're going to talk about the way that the ancient people of old Europe viewed the goddess and death. And what's really cool about talking about death, it's not just sort of this great dark ending, but death in the old goddess worship culture was always connected to rebirth. So we'll look at some of the amazing images from excavations done that have uncovered what an ancient matriarchal civilization, how they faced death, their practices, and what death said to them about life. But before we dive in, if you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please just take a second, click the subscribe button, click the notifications buttons, and that way you can stay in touch and know when new material has dropped. I also just wanted to mention, if you haven't already enrolled in my year-long Herbal Foundations course, there is still time. We have registration open until May 15th. So if you'd like to study with me and learn more about herbal medicine from the Vitalist tradition, go to skyhouseherbs.com, click on courses, and you'll find all the information you need. I'll also include a link below in the description, and you can go directly to the website and enroll. All right. So, I want to give you a rundown of all the different places we're going to go today, because we're going to go to a lot of different spaces within the exploration of death and the goddess. So we are going to take a look at the Neolithic goddess of old Europe, her role in death, practices, regeneration. We're going to look at examples of burial sites and what these have to say about the way their culture was designed. We'll look at figurines of death that they call the stiff white lady. I thought that was pretty cool. So we'll talk about who is the stiff white lady, and and why do we all become her, and how do we all develop from her. And we'll look at what were the death goddess figurines, and what are all the different small markings on them that tell us about the process of dying, death, and transformation. And it will tell us about how these people saw and viewed death as a part of the regenerative cycle. I'm also excited in this video to talk about lemon balm and talk about how the bee, the butterfly, and the chrysalis are connected to the ancient symbols of regeneration and the goddess. And I've got slides and images to show you. So without further ado, let's hop on over and take a look. Okay, so here we are, and let's first start by looking at death and the goddess. And what's important to note is that in this time period, and the Neolithic time period is between 10,000 BCE and about 3,000 BCE. And during this time period in Old Europe, which is the period all around, where it was Italy and Greece and Turkey and Bulgaria, and what was some of the ancient burial sites like Ketal Hayek, and we'll take a look at some of these different places, but kind of that whole region that's kind of west, or no, it would be east of Mesopotamia. That whole region was very, very fertile, and people in that region lived in a matriarchal, goddess-focused and goddess-worshiping culture in peace. They lived in peace for thousands and thousands, 8,000 years about. And so we can learn a lot from this culture and how they lived and how these practices kept them kept their culture intact and kept people working together and kept them in balance with the earth. And I think that's one of the reasons why this particular topic has been so interesting to me, is because I think we can learn a lot from the way our ancestors lived and dream this back into being. We can bring the way our ancestors and people of the old world, the way they lived in accordance with earth and with the rhythms. And if we can understand it, it's easier to live it and to bring it back. And it might not happen in one generation, very likely won't happen in one generation. But I do think it's possible to revive this way of living slowly over time, one culture and one generation at a time. So let's talk about this idea of the goddess and what she embodied for people during the Neolithic time. So the goddess wasn't, like we often think about goddesses from the Greek standpoint, and the ancient goddess worshiping culture, they saw the goddess as accompanying all aspects of the regenerative cycle. So that was from birth to death to regeneration, and rebirth. So all of the processes that we see happening in the plants, season to season, year to year, these were all embodied within the goddess. So the goddess was a holistic, earth-centered, and earth-based understanding of the more subtle plane under which this great universe is being orchestrated. And the patterns that we can count on, if we see these patterns season after season, year after year, we start to build trust in them. And so these ancient people really trusted how nature was teaching them how life worked, and really trusting in this process of death and regeneration. And so it's interesting to note that when the Indo-Europeans started coming in from the West and infiltrating into the East, that these Indo-Europeans brought with them a sky god worshiping culture. So rather than being matriarchal and earth worshiping, they were patriarchal and sky worshiping. And it's not to say one is good or one is bad, one is right, one is wrong. It's just that they bring very different things. And so as the Indo-Europeans came in to Old Europe, we start to see the goddess being divided into many different goddesses. And so we see this as a living example of this is in the Greek culture. So we have the Greek god Artemis, and then Hecate, derived from this aspect of the whole goddess. So the goddess Artemis is the goddess of the moon, the goddess of the hunt, and then sort of the darker qualities of Artemis were then given to Hecate or Hecate. And they were seen as more of like witchcraft and the underworld, and sort of the more darker mystical aspects of Artemis were given to Hecate. So we see again like this splitting of the goddess into all of these different individual qualities. This is true also for Demeter and Kore, and then Persephone. So we see like Demeter, the great goddess, well, she then has a daughter, Persephone. Persephone goes into the underworld and lives with Pluto, or god of the underworld, and she represents then some of the darker qualities of the feminine as well. And so the goddess, like the mother, is sort of fractured into then the daughter, and the daughter goes to the dark side. So it's interesting, I think, to note like how the goddess kind of fell apart in some ways. And what I love about thinking about the goddess as a whole being, sort of going back to this idea of the one goddess, is that it shows that all of these are held within the arms of the continuous cycles of life and death, and all of these stages. And this is included in death too. And in the burial process, we see the worship of the goddess, and the goddess is present. She is not absent or excluded from the death rites and the death process. So I just have a few images here. Here's an image of the old world goddess, very, very common symbols here. We have that V and this very pronounced vulva in the middle. We have these triangles We have these meanderings of water. We have these really wide hips showing fertility and abundance. We have these circles showing the egg and the fertility aspect of the goddess. Her hands over her belly showing that she may be pregnant with life, and she has breasts. And in this particular one, she's seated. And her breasts are small. And in other videos, I've gone over the significance of the breast and the sizes, but everything means something. None of these ancient goddess figures were created without a lot of attention to detail. So I think that's important to notice when we're looking at these images, is just to notice what is being emphasized and what is being diminished. I want to notice too that her arms are very open. And so in the symbol of the goddess, sort of like the whole goddess image, when she is sort of in her abundant phase, look how wide she is, and look at how spacious her arms are to hold things and to fill things. And she has a face. And when we look at images of the death aspect of the goddess, she is very thin, and her face is often masked, or there's no face there. And and her arms are very closed and tight. Here's just an image of the Artemis fountain in Syracuse, Italy. All right, let's go. Let's keep going. The symbols of the goddess in death. So the stiff white lady, it's funny because when Maria Gimbutas talks about this in her books, and everything that I am going over in today's talk is from 2 textbooks, both written by Maria Gimbutas, and I will include links to those in the description. So the 2 books that I have used to really do my research for these presentations come from the work of Lithuanian archaeomythologist Maria Gimbutas. So this is one book, The Gods and Goddesses, or actually it's The Goddess and the Gods of Old Europe, Myths and Cult Images. And the second book of hers is The Language of the Goddess. Both of these books are absolutely wonderful. They've got so many images from both her archaeological digs and then the digs of her students and predecessors and people that went before her, just to give you a sense of some of these images that she talks about and helps us understand. These are some of the drawings from the painting. So we're going to talk in this, I'm going to show you actual images from cave paintings, from vases, and from sculpture. So you can really see how death was personified in the body of the goddess and in different animals like the bull, the bee, the butterfly, and even the vulture. So, all right, let us return now back to sharing some images. So Maria talks about this idea of the stiff white lady as, something that shows, it's an aspect of the goddess, but we can see that she still has the pubic triangle. It's still feminine, female. She has smaller breasts. But what's most notable about these figurines, and, she talks a lot about these figurines, especially a very, very large number of them that were found in the Cycladic sculptures of the Cycladic islands of Greece, just, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these thin images of a woman with her arms tightly crossed across her chest or across her belly or across her body. Is that these are all symbols of, it's not the regenerative part of the divine goddess. It's the ending. It's the chrysalis. And so I think this is a beautiful way of looking at, well, what happens in death? Because in the Western modern culture, death is like we fight it at all costs. And when people die, I think it's natural to grieve. And I know that our ancestors grieved the loss of children and parents and friends and aunties, right? Like, it's not like they didn't grieve, but the understanding of the larger context in which death takes someone, I think, probably eased the grieving process a lot for our ancestors. And so in this talk, I do hope that in looking at death, if we are going through death, or if death comes to someone in our lives, that maybe these images will help us find some peace and solace and comfort. And knowing that the way many ancient cultures saw death was just a transitional point. And so as we look at the arms wrapped around this stiff white lady, I always chuckle when I say that. It is like she's becoming embalmed and in a chrysalis. And so look at that. She is nude. She is open to the world, but she is stiff. She is hardened. Her legs are together. She is narrow. And these goddess figures were often carved into white bone, stone, clay, and marble. And these are some images here from the Met Museum in New York City. So you can see these are both from the Cycladic sites. And, really these were mostly found in burial sites. So the chrysalid lady, I think, is such a beautiful way to, it's a little kinder than the stiff white lady, but both are true. Two things can be true. So we see the arms folded tightly across the chest. There's often dots, like the dots we find on the pupa of a cocoon or chrysalis of butterflies. The goddess is always rigid and still. And the position is typical to the position of the dead as they were buried in the cemeteries of old Europe. So if we look at these figures here are her arms tightly folded across her chest. Here's another image of the arms across the chest. And then these little dots and markings along the side and along the waist. And yeah, I think it's important to note that there are similarities between the pupa dots and the dots of these figurines. Another interesting thing to note is that this particular female figure was carved into marble. And so I just included this quote here. The early Cycladic artists maybe chose marble, perhaps because of its translucent and crystalline nature, which captures the sun's light and endows the finished works with their own brilliant inner luminosity. So again, in this image of death, we have this translucent ability for it to still hold and carry and reflect light. And again, the idea of these people was that death is only a step in this ever-changing cycle. So it is not an ending, but it's the marking of a new beginning. Here are some images of the connection of the goddess of death and rebirth to the butterfly. So here is an old vase with the caterpillar motif on it. And then we see some of these sort of pupa chrysalis shapes on the vase itself. We also see this double axes that happen a lot in the Catalhuyuk frescoes of this particular region. I think it was in Turkey. But I want you to just notice here's the double axes, and they look like butterfly wings. So this is the painted representation of the goddess with wings in the shape of the double axe resembling a butterfly on a floral stem. This was the late Minoan island of Moklos, Crete. Here's another image, a painted representation of a goddess with wings in the shape of a double axe on a middle Minoan 3 vase from Knossos. And then here is an image of bucrania and ritual horns surmounted by the double axe or butterfly. So in the last video I did on the bull, and the bull being a symbol of becoming and regeneration. Look at this. Here is the bull's skull and the bull horns. And what is coming up and out of it but this double axe or this butterfly of regeneration? And so, we can think about this idea of in death, there's always the absolute of being reborn. We all must die to be reborn, and we see this again and again and again in the images of this period. Another really cool thing that we see in these ancient goddess or stiff white ladies is the presence of holes and sacred dots. And so in one of the things Maria Gimbutas points to about these holes is that holes were seen as portals, just like in the birth canal. So if you can imagine our ancestors watching a baby be born. So you've got this hole, and here comes this head through this passageway of the birth canal. And all of a sudden there's a new life in a woman or like a midwife's arms. So this idea of the circle and a round hole as being a passageway of birth was taken also to be the portal into death. And so in a lot of these stiff lady figurines from the Baltic Sea coast of Bulgaria, which we see in this top image right here, are these holes as passageways, right? So we see passageways through the ears, passageway through the heart, passageways through the hands, all of these dots around the triangle, the pubic triangle of the vulva of regeneration and rebirth. And here's a very, very sort of ancient, very nondescript, kind of abstract view of the goddess with these holes. And again, this idea of the hole as being a passage through which we are reborn. And that was an absolute understanding. So these were buried with people of all different, there were no classes in this time. There were no, kings or queens or, higher or lower castes. Everyone lived in the same, with the same means. Things were shared cooperatively. And so different people were buried with these figurines from all different walks of life throughout the village. Here's another image of the stiff white lady. Again, notice how narrow the hips are. This one doesn't even have arms, but we've got the dots of the pupa around the arms and here around the head, and we've got the holes through the eyes and a hole through the navel. So again, rebirth, rebirth. This image here, the one with the red background, was from Spain. So these are ancient Spanish images of that thin white death goddess. Arms, but look at that, arms tightly folded across the belly, the pubic triangle, and look at these chevrons moving down like water, moving down her back. And these were also, images buried with people to help them rebirth themselves. So I wanted to just say a few things about this image and actually really of the sacred holes. So the holes were seen by the ancient goddesses as the birth canal, right? The way by which things go into life. But they were also seen as the passageways into which things must die. And so I'll show you in the next few slides how they built their tombs to be in the shape of either a female goddess or to be in the shape of the uterus and even the entryway as two legs. And so you walk between the two legs to enter into the passageway of the uterus where people were then buried so that they could be reborn. But the image of the holes is really interesting because holes were used, especially when they would find stones with holes in them. They were considered to be miracle stones. And so there were rituals that were done where they would actually take babies or children who were ill and pass them head first through these large holes in the stones. And that was thought to be something that would bring about spontaneous healing for the person. Also, caves were seen as having the power of the womb to heal and transform. And people were used the caves as sites of initiation where they would sleep in the womb to be reborn or to move into a sacred new phase of life. Holes in the ears. We see a lot of the goddess figurines had holes through their ears, and piercings were very common during that time. And even in the goddess statues, we see gold fashioned in hoops that were put around the figurines of the goddess placed in the tombs. What else do we see? Oh, we also see in the holes of trees. So trees that had holes in them were also seen as healing places in nature. So people would go and spend time inside of a hollowed out tree to receive healing or to receive initiation. So I think that's really interesting to note and something we can bring into modern practice too, of thinking about rites of passage. How do we include places in nature that we know of? And I actually spent my birthday in a cave with a friend, and we brought a drum and we drummed and we laid there and we prayed and listened to music in this womb cave. To mark a really special moment in time for me, my birthday, and for my friend, the transition for her body into a body of spring. So I think that's just so powerful. We can bring those images and those practices back in to the world we live in today. So yeah, you could also crawl through a hole in a cave and crawl through a hole in a tree to receive that blessing. And this was continued in the cultures of Scotland, England, and France, and many other countries. So it didn't just end with the Neolithic people in old Europe. It was carried on and may still live on today. Here are some really beautiful womb-like burial sites. So here is one where we have the image of the goddess's legs, and here is the walkway through. And this has been the top, the mound is now missing, but you would walk through this passageway, and then people would be buried here, often in a fetal position. Here's a womb-like burial site. So you can see here is like the image of the goddess, and these were different burial chambers. Here's another one, the entryway. This is like much like the vagina, like you go in through the vagina and then you go into these little areas like the uterus. So you go through the canal into these larger openings, and we see like a larger goddess with smaller goddesses all around. And again, these were all the ways that it was considered, if one were to dig a burial site, it should be as womb and goddess-like as possible, because the idea here is that we're returning back to the mother. And they would also, next to the bodies, often include vases filled with red ochre that was like blood. And so just as blood was shed in death, blood was needed for the process of rebirth. So they were buried with containers of red substances. This idea of the tomb as womb, I think, is so beautiful. And I even imagine for myself one day when I leave my body, I would love for my body to be buried, like in a hole in the earth covered by flowers, and for my body to be in a fetal position and to have flowers and trees planted above my body so that I can be regenerated, that my body can be a source of nourishment for the earth around it, and these cycles of rebirth that happen above where I may be buried. And I love this idea of the earth under which people are buried becomes the mother of the dead. So the earth is the mother of the dead. And there's just something really beautiful about that death is not like, we're not put into this inert place under, we're not like sent out to outer space. Our bodies can be put into the earth, back into the mother, back into the womb. And so the mother of the dead idea lives on in many folk tales, including in Latvian folk song. There's a particular song called The Mother of the Grave that is often sung. And it's a song of celebration as one is laid to rest. Also, burial resembles being returned to the womb, just like the seed is planted in the earth. And in order for that plant to grow, it must be buried. And the same idea for our body, that our body must be given back to the earth to be reborn. And they even talk about this idea of there were mother ovens. So the oven was also built like a big, large, round womb often. And sometimes, they did practice cremation. And this was actually way more common in India. But this idea of like burning the body, which is like giving the body back to the warm flames of a mother womb oven. And I think that, again, it's like there's so many ways we can reframe the offering of the body to the earth, which makes it like a sacrament and a gift to the earth. And I think that's such a beautiful way of envisioning our passing. Here are some other images, the goddess as the insect, bee, and butterfly. And again, this idea of the arms crossed around and the stiff white lady is this idea of her being transformed from the caterpillar into the pupa through this very messy stage of transformation and then being reborn into a butterfly. And we see this also being we see this in the hieroglyphs in Egypt with the beetle or the scarab representing this rebirth process. And in ancient old Europe, they saw it as, the bee and the butterfly were common motifs. Also, the association with the beetle and scarab and the bee, butterfly, and the bull as being associated with the moon. And it's interesting to note that both the horns of the bull, which are shaped like a crescent moon, and the antennae and wings of the bee and butterfly, which sort of have this crescent shape, are related. And so look at these wonderful images. This is an image of the goddess. And look, she sort of has like a bee-shaped head. Look at her long, her long bee-shaped arms. She's got the fish symbol of regeneration around here. Here are the howling dogs of death that are around here. Here's the symbol of the bull of regeneration and new beginnings. The tadpole of new life, right? And the birds, as well as the bearers of abundance and goddess and blessings, right? So there's so many images here that show like the death is not the end. Death is a part of the whole regenerative cycle. Here is an onyx gem from Knossos portraying the bee goddess flanked by winged dogs, the bull horns and double axe butterfly above her head. And it's funny because like part of me is like, that looks kind of like an alien. Like I want, like, what if they had contact with, realms that the modern Western person hasn't had access to. But if any of you have ever done any psychedelics and stood out under the night sky and have heard the hum of the cosmos, it is clear that there is life out there and that there are realms beyond our normal conscious understanding. So when I see these images, I am not surprised, right? Like this looks in line with what I've experienced in altered states and in ritual states of consciousness, of this connection between this sort of alien bug world and the human world. And we see this in a lot of different cultures all over the world, including Australia, right? So just take note of this as well. Here's a beautiful, beautiful bronze sculpture etching of the bee goddess. Isn't that gorgeous? This is Melissa. So I want to talk about that too, because that is going to bring us to our herb of this particular death cycle exploration. Before we go into that, I want to talk about a few other animals that were often associated with the death goddess and were often included in goddess statues that were found in tombs and burials and in rites of passage around death. So we often see vultures. Here is an image of the vulture with sort of these, the wings are sort of like brooms, kind of cleaning things up, cleaning up corpses. And so here are the vultures coming in to clean the corpses. And this was something that was actually, vultures were sacred animals. They were sacred birds that were a part of the regenerative cycle. We also see owls being depicted a lot, and hawks and doves and boars, since boars are kind of scavenging pigs, and then howling dogs. So all of these are often associated with the goddess cycle of death. So I wanted to read to you now an excerpt from The Gods of Old Europe, or I keep saying the gods, it's because that's how it was originally published. Sorry, The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe by Maria Gimbutas. So let me start with bees are begotten of bulls' regeneration. Let me read this to you from The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe. The most appropriate time, let me go back. The bee and the butterfly, the bull-born goddess of transformation and regeneration. Before we discuss the epiphany of the great goddess in the shape of a bee or butterfly, we must mention the ancient belief that bees are begotten of bulls. One of the earliest writers to mention the bull-born bee is Antigonos of Charistos, about 250 BC, who says, "In Egypt, if you bury the ox in certain places, so that only his horns project above the ground, and then saw them off, they say that bees fly out, for the ox putrefies and is resolved into bees." So that's a quote. And then she goes on to say, the most appropriate time for this method of reproducing bees was said to be when the sun entered the sign of the bull or Taurus. Nearly 3 centuries later, Ovid speaks of Aristaeus, the honey lord, who was weeping because all of his bees had died, leaving the honeycombs unfinished. On the advice of his mother, he captured Proteus, the magician, who told him that he must bury the carcass of a slaughtered ox and that from it he would obtain what he wanted. For when the carcass was decayed, swarms of bees would issue from it. The death of one produced 1,000 lives. So here we see, the sacrifice of one thing, of one body, can produce thousands of others. I want to go on because this connects us to other things. So I want to say this. Likewise, he recounts this method of obtaining the ox-born bees. A further exploration of vital importance is given by Porphyry AD. So that is the first part, that from the bull comes the bees. The next piece that is so interesting and beautiful is that Artemis is a bee and she is Melissa. And this is where we get the name for lemon balm. The Latin name for lemon balm, or the botanical name, is Melissa officinalis. So this is a beautiful image of a gold ring that was found near Knossos, portraying the goddess Right and 3 worshippers. And note that the hands and the heads of them are that of an insect and possibly bees. And this almost looks kind of like a beehive or a honeycomb. So here we have maybe the ritual dance of the goddess. So let me read this to you because this is really beautiful as well. All right. From this passage, we learn that Artemis is a bee, Melissa, and that both she and the bull belong to the moon. Hence, both are connected with the idea of a periodic regeneration. We also learn that souls are bees, that Melissa draws souls down to be born. The idea of a life in death is this singularity interesting concept is expressed by the belief that the life of the bull is passed into that of the bees. Here we have the very essence of the meaning of sacrifice, which is also applicable to Neolithic and Paleolithic Europe, as well as to the Minoan civilization. And I wanted to say too about the image that I showed you. She is here, the goddess of periodic regeneration. She is shown with a fish inside her, a symbol of fecundity relating to water. And this is the one of the Great Mother. So we have this association with Artemis being a bee and being part of the Melissa. And there's some really cool connections between the way that the goddess and the Melissa were then spoken of, and how this sort of transferred into some of the rites of passage. So I wanted to just mention this part here. The apiculture, or keeping hives of the Minoans, is documented by hieroglyphs, representations of actual beehives, engraved images, and myths. The Greeks, who, like the rest of the Indo-Europeans, knew only of wild honey, inherited beekeeping from the Minoans. They borrowed even the most important name, sphex or bee, and symbolos, hive, and propolis or Corinthos. They also inherited the mythical image of the great goddess as a bee, the goddess of regeneration, the image of her virgin priestess or nymphs as bees, and many other myths and beliefs connected with the bee and honey. The Cretians, on the other hand, must have held bees in high esteem from the beginning of the Neolithic area. The fact that we have been considering the bee rather than the butterfly doesn't imply that in ancient mythology the bee was more important of the two. Both were equally ancient and essential in the symbolism associated with the goddess. The difficulty is that in the schematic prehistoric reliefs or paintings of the goddess, we can recognize little more than an insect head or insect hands. Whether she is a lady bee or a lady butterfly cannot be determined. There's another thing that's really beautiful here. In most Neolithic reliefs, such as that of the Kokapart, the image of the goddess can be interpreted as representing either a bee or butterfly. The scene on the gold ring, so this is the image that I'm showing you right now, includes 4 female figures in festival attire, perhaps portraying the goddess and her devotees, usually assumed to be the Melissa or the bees. Their heads and hands are certainly those of an insect, but we cannot be sure of what kind. Fascinating, just fascinating. So that brings us to the herb Melissa or Melissa officinalis, a wonderful herb that has a very long and historical ancient use in both embalming and in funeral rites. So we know that in Egypt, honey was used in the embalming process. And while in old Europe, they didn't embalm bodies in the same way, they did often use lemon balm and other nicely scented herbs to freshen the scent of the departed. So we can think about the scent of that lemon up. It's, lemon balm is a very fresh, clean, uplifting scent. And so it was used in the embalming process along with honey, but it was also, again, just used in funerals and used in rituals because of its uplifting and really clearing scent. What I love about lemon balm in modern use as an herbalist is that it is very safe. I mean, it can be used in pregnancy, it can be used in breastfeeding, you can use it with children. I've used it with my babies as young as 6 months for colic by making a very dilute tea. The only contraindication is that there have been some studies that have shown it is possible it may have a negative effect on those when it's taken in high doses for those taking thyroid medication. So if you're taking thyroid medication, just use moderate doses. Don't go crazy with it. But overall, it is a wonderful herb, uplifting and relaxing at the same time, which is very rare. So it has both this sort of cheering and relaxing. So it's great for insomnia and sleep. And it's also great for depression. And I personally love to use it for social gatherings because it's a plant of the bees. And I often think about when I'm having a social event that I want everyone to get buzzy together, like have this sort of cohesive energy, like a hive of bees working together. And so I'll often include Melissa or bee balm in my tea blend so that I can just sort of bring the energy of the group together. It's also very, very easy to grow. It's a mint family plant, so it will spread. Be wary. If you don't want it to spread, it is best to grow it in a pot. And the parts that are used are the aerial parts. So you can use the leaves, the stems, and the flowers. I like to dry it and then use it as a tea, about maybe 1 tablespoon in 2 cups of hot water. Let it steep for about 20 minutes and then strain and drink. You can also make it as a tincture or a glycerate, and the dosage for that is about 1 to 2 dropperfuls or 15 to 30 drops. I mean, really as much as, as often as you want, but classically it's like 3 to 5 times per day. It is also a wonderful herb to add in. I really like to add this to my nettles overnight infusion or chamomile tea. Because on its own, it's a very mild flavored herb, so I do like to add it sometimes to others if I want more of a stronger flavor profile. For that reason, it also works well with mint. And you can make it into a fresh vinegar, which works really nice to use in salads and soups and stir fries. The last thing I'll say is that Melissa, as we read from Maria Gimbutas's work, was seen as the goddess who draws souls down to be born. So I also think about this as like a very regenerative and an herb of rebirth. It's one of the first ones to come up in the spring. It's coming up in my garden again. It's so bright green. I mean, its leaves are like the freshest fresh green that you can imagine. It's got this very vital look to it. And I think about it as a wonderful herb if you're going through really hard times, if you're in the process of grieving, if you are going through a transition into a new phase of life or a new relationship or a new work situation, anything like that. Melissa was seen to be the garter of doorways and passageways. And so we can think about this herb as being one that can support us through a rebirth of any aspect of our lives. So I hope that you will work with Melissa or work with lemon balm in your own life in some way, whether it's growing it, using it as a tea or as a tincture, thinking about this ancient herb as a way to help us remember that things have to die back in order to be reborn, that we have to go into that figure of the chrysalis or of the stiff white woman that we see in a lot of the Neolithic sculptures, of the arms tightly wrapped across the chest, the face blank, legs together, very closed and shut inward, so that we can get really, really still to be reborn. And in this video, I hope you found some very helpful ways of viewing the way that the goddess cultures embraced death and the way they celebrated death and the way that they saw death as just one part of the larger cycle of life and of the nature of reality. So with that, I take this video to its end. I thank you for being here. If you have anything to share, if there was anything that stood out to you, let me know. You may have noticed that I'm actually wearing a little bee necklace myself. This was from my great Aunt Angie, and she is one of my Sicilian ancestors. And I don't know where she got this from. I think she may have gotten it from Vegas. Isn't that random? She liked to gamble, she had some, she had a history. She was a very interesting Sicilian woman, but this comes from her. So I feel like there's something really powerful about having talismans and images and jewelry that remind us of the bee and the butterfly and the goddess. So if you have anything to adorn your body with as we're moving through, transitional cycles, do that for yourself. Put those on, carry them in your pocket, and just notice how they support you. All right, my friends, until the next episode, I look forward to seeing you there.